what is the day of reckoning that that you see coming?
Well, I see it on several fronts, but both in fiscal and monetary policy, we've gone through several decades where we've relied as a government on essentially covering our expenses by borrowing, and we've relied on juicing up the economy by continually having very low and actually on an after inflation, after tax basis, negative cost of borrowing. My point is somewhat simple. I just can't see the debt growing forever. It's a Concord Coalition, almost part of its Bible, if you want to call it that. But I see the same thing on monetary policy. You can have negative real rates with inflation, but it's pretty hard to have negative nominal rates. And we've gone down this path for so long, I think it's ending. And that brings a day of reckoning. Let me give you one statistic that even I found surprising, although the three of you probably know it well. But I looked at the debt to GDP in 1980, and I looked at interest cost relative to GDP. I'm talking about federal debt and federal interest cost. And the federal debt is essentially quadrupled roughly since then. I think it was something like 26% of GDP in 1980 when we worried about whether the Reagan tax cuts could be afforded. It's now, essentially at 100% of GDP. So it's quadrupled. It's interesting that the interest cost as a share of the debt, as a share of GDP, has basically been the same. So you've had this fourfold growth in debt without any increase in interest cost. Well, that's allowed Congress to get by for a long time with thinking that there's no consequence to borrowing more because at least it's not showing up in the interest rate. Well, that day's ending for two reasons, and I'll stop there and let you throw in some more questions. But for two reasons. One is the interest rate's not going to fall much further, I don't think. In fact, it didn't fall much further. It actually was, and that was part of the article, it actually went up recently by several percentage points nominally. It even went up in real terms. So that day ended, but also at some point, these additional interest costs, when they're not offset by a lower interest rate, will continually add to interest cost. And I don't think people fully realize that if interest rates even just stay common, when you start running debt at this level, the compounding really does start adding up. It's not offset by the lower interest rates.
Well, just to build on that statistic, interest costs, I was surprised when I looked into this earlier this year that while interest costs have stayed remarkably low, as you point out, the projection going forward, even with the projected relatively low rates that CBO is using, interest costs exceed their highest level as a percentage of GDP within the 10-year budget window. It's like it's over 3%, 3.5%, something like that, and of course going up. So it is a rising burden.
So let me just add on the monetary side. I've written for a long time about my problem with negative cost of borrowing, because I think it's one of the causes of growing wealth inequality. Because when you look at asset growth versus debt, for a lot of the lower and middle income classes, the additional debt is just reducing their net worth. In the richer classes, the low cost of borrowing is allowing them to leverage up and buy assets really on the cheap. And so it's actually adding to wealth inequality. And it's also, I think, leading to unproductive investment, because if you have a negative cost of borrowing, all you have to do is get a negative return from your asset that's less negative than your cost of borrowing, and you can make money. So I think it's causing incentives to have weak and sometimes bad investment. We're financing a lot of things that aren't all that productive.